Imagine this. You wake up in a tiny wooden cottage. No mattress, no toilet, no phone. Just rats chewing on your boots and a bucket of water that smells like old cabbage. Welcome to the sleepy historian. People love to romanticize the past. Oh, I was born in the wrong era. Really? You sure about that? You wouldn't last a day. And tonight, I'm going to prove it. We're talking disease, dungeons, and diarrhea. Everything they didn't teach you in school. So grab a drink, preferably one that isn't full of parasites, and buckle in. This isn't just a history lesson, it's a survival test. And hey, if you enjoy this kind of dark dive into the past, hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a comment. Would you survive 24 hours in medieval times? Let's get into it. You've seen the movies, right? The glistening armor, the royal feasts, the rolling green hills with a towering castle in the distance. Maybe you even imagined yourself riding a horse through a meadow as a noble knight or a graceful maiden waiting in a tower. Let me stop you right there, because if you woke up in a real medieval village, the first thing you'd notice is the smell. And not just a farm fresh kind of smell. I'm talking about a thick, nose-punching, eyes-watering funk that never quite leaves. Why? Because everyone stank. You stank. Your neighbors stank. Even the lord in the castle? Yep, he stank, just in fancier clothes. There were no showers, no deodorant, no toothpaste, not even proper soap for most people. If you wanted to bathe, you'd need access to warm water and a wooden tub, and that was a luxury. Most peasants? Maybe once a year, if that. And the water? Oh no, you don't want to bathe in that. Because even the rivers and wells were usually filled with, let's just say, multi-purpose waste. People dumped everything into the streets. I mean, everything. Garbage, animal guts, even raw sewage. And guess where all that ends up? The same rivers people fetched water from. But let's say you try to tough it out. You hold your breath, squint through the filth, and say, well, I'm built different. All right, let's check your hair. Or rather, what's living in your hair? Because medieval times were a golden age for lice. Lice in your hair, your eyebrows, even in your clothes. And oh yes, fleas too. Everyone had them, even royalty. There were no shampoos, no laundry machines. You wore the same itchy wool or rough linen every day through work, sleep, rain, and sweat, washing clothes. Maybe if you had time or access to clean water, maybe. And underwear? Not a thing for most peasants. And now you're itchy, your skin's breaking out, your feet are swollen from walking on rough ground with barely their shoes. But wait, you haven't even brushed your teeth. Oh yeah, dental care. They didn't have any. Toothbrushes weren't common. Toothpaste didn't exist. Most people used things like ash, salt, or sticks. But here's the kicker. Sugar was starting to spread through Europe during the later medieval period, especially among the wealthy. So if you were noble, you probably had black, rotting teeth. If you were poor, you just didn't have many left. Either way, chewing food was not a pleasant experience. And if you got a toothache, well, good luck. The local barber surgeon might yank it out with rusty pliers while you scream into a leather strap. No numbing, no gloves, no sterilization, and definitely no follow-up care. It's easy to forget that even the most basic things we take for granted, running water, flushing toilets, daily showers, a toothbrush, were completely unheard of for most of human history. In medieval Europe, a single infected cut could kill you. A case of the flu could mean your funeral. And that funky smell in the air? It wasn't just unpleasant, it was a warning sign. Because where there's filth, there's disease. Typhoid, dysentery, tuberculosis. Entire villages were sometimes wiped out by illnesses we can treat today with a pill and a nap. And remember the Black Death? Yeah, that wasn't some one-off event. It came in waves. And by the time it was done, it had wiped out 1/3 of Europe. 1/3. But that's a story for later. So the next time you fantasize about living in a castle, maybe add in a few details, like the rats under your bed, the chamber pot sloshing in the corner, or your neighbor casually throwing a bucket of poop into the street, where kids are playing with a stick and a dead bird. Still romantic? Didn't think so. Hygiene alone would break most modern people in half. You wouldn't even make it to lunch without questioning every life choice that brought you here. And guess what? That's just the beginning. Because if you thought the smells were bad, wait till you hear what's on the dinner table. All right, let's say you've survived the smell, the filth, and the lice for a few hours. Your stomach growls. And now you're thinking, okay, maybe the food'll make up for it. Yeah, no, that's the trap. Because when people think medieval food, they picture giant turkey legs and overflowing banquet tables, maybe a roasted boar with an apple in its mouth. But unless you were royalty, and even then, the food was more likely to kill you than nourish you. Let's break this medieval menu down. First up, meat. If you were a peasant, which, let's be real, 90% of people were, meat was rare. It was expensive, it was taxed, it belonged to your lord. You might get some salted pork or dried fish if you were lucky, once in a while. But when you did get meat, it was probably already going bad. And medieval people knew their meat was sketchy, so they'd cover it in spices. Not because it tasted good, but because it masked the smell of rot. Yet the dinner spice blend wasn't for flavor, it was a cover-up operation. You weren't seasoning your meat, you were disguising it. And that's if you were lucky. Because the average peasant meal was gruel, a sad, watery porridge made from grains, sometimes with a few vegetables, sometimes with something that used to be a vegetable. Bread was a staple too, but even that wasn't safe. Medieval bakers didn't have modern ovens or consistent ingredients. So your daily bread might be mixed with chalk, clay, sawdust, whatever bulked it up cheap. And even if it was clean, there's this little thing called ergot, a fungus that grows on rye. Eat enough ergot-infected bread, and boom, hallucinations, seizures, even death. Some historians even think outbreaks of mass hysteria and witch sightings were just towns tripping on bad bread. Let's talk about veggies. Sounds safe, right? Wrong. There were no pesticides, no refrigeration, no hygiene standards. Vegetables were often grown in soil fertilized with, you guessed it, human or animal waste. And guess what they rinsed it with? That same contaminated water from the well. Food poisoning was so common, it was basically a lifestyle. Now you might say, okay, but what about the nobles? Didn't they eat well? Well, kinda. They had access to better ingredients, but not better knowledge. A lot of what they ate was boiled into mush, seasoned to the extreme, or so heavy it made people physically ill. And remember, they had no idea what balanced nutrition was. They thought eating too many vegetables was bad for your humors. Fruit, only if it was cooked, raw, might kill you. So the rich mostly ate meat and bread, and maybe drank wine or ale all day. Because the water was poison, remember? No vitamins, no fiber, just a steady march toward constipation and gout. And the drinks? Ale was the go-to. Everyone drank it, including kids. Why? Because it was safer than water. Boiling during brewing helped kill bacteria. But don't imagine some nice cold pint. Medieval ale was warm, flat, and cloudy, and often made in the same bucket that doubled as your cousin's bathtub last week. Refreshing. And there were no snacks, no vending machines, no popping over to the pantry at midnight. You ate what was available, when it was available. If the harvest failed, or your lord took too much, you didn't eat. That was reality. Famine wasn't rare. Whole families, sometimes entire villages, starved to death in bad years. All it took was a few months of bad weather, and suddenly people were boiling leather shoes for dinner. No joke, that actually happened. So, yeah, food wasn't just a matter of taste. It was a gamble. Every bite could mean illness, infection, or hallucination. And yet, you had to eat because farming was hard labor. And that brings us to the next problem. You're not just surviving the food, you're surviving the cure. Because when your stomach finally gives out and you start puking up whatever that mystery meat was, guess who's about to pay you a visit? Not a doctor. A dude with a knife, a bucket, and maybe a leech or two. Let's talk about medicine. So, you've braved the filth. You stomached the suspicious meat, but now your stomach's turning inside out, and your fever is climbing. You're sick, and in medieval times, that means you're in real danger. But don't worry, help is on the way, in the form of a barber. Yep, your local barber surgeon was the medieval version of a doctor, and he didn't just cut hair. He also pulled teeth, stitched wounds, and, if you were lucky, didn't kill you in the process. Let's start with how medieval people understood sickness. They didn't know about germs, or bacteria, or viruses. There was no wash your hands, no antibiotics, no sterile anything. Instead, their entire understanding of health was based on bodily fluids. Seriously, it's called the four humors theory. They believed the body was made up of blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. And if you got sick, it meant your humors were out of balance. The solution? Well, obviously, drain some blood. Bloodletting was the go-to cure for everything. Headache? Bloodletting. Stomach cramps? Bloodletting. Stubbed toe? Probably bloodletting. Sometimes they used knives, sometimes they used leeches. Either way, you lost blood, a lot of it, and if that didn't fix you, which it didn't, they'd just take more. And if you passed out, they figured that meant it was working. Now imagine this. You've got a fever, you're vomiting, you can't keep food down. And here comes this guy with wine on his breath and a rusty scalpel, saying, "You need a trepanation." What's that, you ask? It's where they drill a hole in your skull to let the bad spirits out. No anesthesia, no sterilization. No real reason, either. This was considered cutting-edge medicine. Other treatments included boiling herbs and pouring them on open wounds, forcing you to swallow mercury, nyap, the toxic kind, pigeon carcasses placed on your feet to draw out sickness, burning dried toads and inhaling the smoke, and somehow that wasn't even the worst of it. Let's talk about the Black Death, the bubonic plague. It hit in the 1300s and wiped out entire cities. 1/3 of Europe gone. No one knew what caused it. People blamed bad air, sinners, cats, foreigners, even witches. The cure? Some towns tried prayer, others tried flagellation, literally whipping themselves in the streets to earn God's forgiveness. Others burned entire groups of people, thinking it would stop the plague from spreading. It didn't. And the doctors? Well, they wore long robes and bird-like masks filled with sweet-smelling herbs, not to protect you, but to block out the smell of corpses. Because let's be honest, by the time the doctor arrived, you were probably already dead. Childbirth was another death sentence waiting to happen. No hospitals, no trained professionals, just wise women doing their best in candlelight, in the dirt, without tools or sanitation. Many women didn't survive childbirth. Many babies didn't either. And if they did, odds were high they wouldn't make it past age 5. The average life expectancy in medieval Europe, somewhere between 30 and 40 years. And that's if you beat the odds. It wasn't that medieval people were stupid. They were doing the best they could with what they had. But they lived in a time before science, before understanding, before safety. Getting sick back then wasn't an inconvenience. It was a crisis. And unless you were rich enough to afford exotic remedies or travel to a monastery with decent care, your treatment might actually make things worse. So when we talk about you wouldn't last a day in medieval times, we're not kidding. Because even one minor infection, one bad piece of meat, or one unlucky sneeze from a plague-ridden rat could have been the end of your story. And now, you're cold, you're weak, you've survived the bad bread, the bloodletting, and your brush with death. So naturally, it's time to get dressed. And believe me, you're not ready. You made it through the night, barely. You've survived the smells, the food, the medieval medicine. Congrats, you didn't die. Yet, now it's morning, and it's time to get dressed. Seems simple enough, right? Yeah, not in the Middle Ages. Because nothing you wore was comfortable, clean, or remotely designed with sanity in mind. Let's start with the peasants. 90% of the population. Your wardrobe was basically one tunic, one pair of pants, one coarse cloak if you were lucky, and maybe some foot wrappings or rough leather shoes. These clothes weren't rotated or washed every few days. You wore them until they were unwearable, months, sometimes years. They were made from wool or linen, and they itched like crazy. Also, no underwear. Like, not just bad underwear, literally none. And socks? Don't be cute. Now, add rain, or sweat, or dirt. And remember, there's no detergent, no dryer. Washing your clothes was a major chore. First, you had to find cleanish water, then scrub everything by hand, then hang it up and hope it didn't mold. Most people didn't bother. So, guess what lived in your clothes? Lice, fleas, ticks, tiny roommates with zero rent. Okay, but what if you're not a peasant? What if you're nobility? Well, now your problems are fancier. Because upper class outfits weren't just uncomfortable, they were torture devices. Let's talk about corsets. These weren't cute, Instagrammable waist trainers. They were stiff, breath-stealing, organ-shifting traps. Young women were expected to wear them from an early age, laced so tight that some couldn't even sit or eat properly. Pass out from lack of oxygen? Just part of the look. And then there were the layers. A nobleman might wear a linen shirt, a padded doublet, a robe, a surcoat, a belt with a dagger for lined sleeves, hose, tight hose. Imagine walking around in all that in the summer. No air conditioning, no breathable fabric, no relief. People fainted in churches. People roasted at feasts. People straight up melted in their own velvet. Also, if you were rich, your clothes had to show it. So instead of being practical, they were overloaded with embroidery, jewels, and absurd cuts. Some dresses had sleeves that dragged on the floor. Some shoes were so long and pointy, you had to tie the tips to your knees just to walk. Because nothing says wealth like not being able to move. And if you were wearing black, people assumed you were super important or super cursed because dark dyes were expensive and also made with toxic metals. But in a fun twist, some clothes literally poisoned you over time. And don't even get me started on shoes. If you were poor, wooden clogs or rags. If you were rich, fashionable slippers with zero grip and no support. You know what's fun? Slipping in the mud and dying tragically on the way to Mass. Stylish and slippery. But here's the part people forget. Your clothes didn't just reflect your status, they defined it. Literally. Sumptuary laws told people what they could and couldn't wear by law. If you were a peasant caught wearing rich colors or fabrics, fined, beaten, possibly arrested, because in medieval society, clothing wasn't self-prescriptive. It was a cage. You were born into your outfit and you died in it. So whether you were sweating in silk or freezing in a sackcloth tunic, Clothing in the Middle Ages wasn't about comfort or creativity. It was about control, plus, and surviving the elements with nothing but itchy wool and a prayer. But let's say you did manage to get dressed without suffocating, slicing your ankle, or accidentally violating the class code. Now you're ready to go outside. Just don't get arrested. Because the medieval justice system, let's just say it wasn't big on due process. All right, you've survived the stench. You've eaten the questionable bread. You've worn the itchy wool and survived bloodletting by candlelight. Now you're feeling confident, so you head into town. Maybe you trade some grain. Maybe you gossip. Maybe, just maybe, you say something a little too loud about the Lord's taxes. Whoops, arrested. And now you're in deep trouble. Medieval justice was creative. And by creative, I mean horrifying. There was no Miranda rights, no public defenders, no innocent until proven guilty. You were poor, you were probably guilty, you were new in town, suspicious. You couldn't pay a fine, guess what? You're going to jail. And jail wasn't a place to wait for trial. Jail was the punishment. Dark, damp, cold, disease-ridden holes in the ground. No toilets, no light, no food unless your family brought it. You could rot there for months or years. And if you died, well, that's one less case on the books. But let's say you made it to trial. Lucky you. It wasn't about facts. It was about oaths and ordeals, which were exactly as bad as they sound. Let me explain. There were a few types. Trial by fire. You hold a red-hot iron bar or walk over burning coals. If your wounds heal clean in 3 days, innocent. If they don't, guilty, and probably dead from infection anyway. Trial by water. You're tied up and thrown into a river. If you float, guilty, because water rejects the sinful. If you sink, innocent, congrats, you drown. Trial by combat. You fight someone, sometimes your accuser. Winner is innocent, loser is dead. And yeah, if you were an old woman fighting a soldier, well, GG. Justice was basically a game of let's see if you survive. And if you didn't, they just assumed God made the decision. But let's say you were convicted the regular way. Someone accused you and you couldn't defend yourself. You weren't always executed. Sometimes they got really creative with the punishments. Everyday torture and public humiliation. Let's break out the greatest hits. The stocks. Your head and hands locked in wood in the middle of the street for hours or days. People threw stuff at you. Rotten food, dead animals, whatever they had. Entertainment, branding. They literally burned letters into your skin. T for thief. F for forger. You wore your crime forever. Hoping public lashings were common, sometimes inside churches. A little spiritual motivation while you bled. Mutilation. Lose a hand for stealing. Lose an ear for lying. Lose your tongue for talking too much. And then there were the executions. Public. Spectacular. Often the weekend event. Hanging was common. Beheading, if you were noble. burning at the stake for heretics and witches. And the real star of the show, drawing and quartering. If you don't know what that is, you might sleep better not knowing. The point wasn't just punishment, it was fear. People needed to see what happened to rule breakers. Loud, bloody, and public. And don't think you were safe just because you followed the rules. Sometimes someone in power just didn't like you. Sometimes a rumor was enough. And if you were a woman, a foreigner, or poor, you were always one wrong word away from doom. Yeah. You might think twice before stealing a loaf of bread, or skipping church, or saying the wrong thing in a tavern. Because in medieval times, justice wasn't blind, it's armed, angry, and not interested in second chances. And if you think being executed was the worst possible fate, try going to war. Because when the battlefield comes to your doorstep, no one is safe. War in medieval times wasn't a Netflix event you watched from the couch. It wasn't something you read about weeks later in a newspaper. Nope. War was a surprise guest, showing up without warning, without mercy, and without a single care that you were just trying to milk your cow in peace. You didn't have to be a knight to experience war. You didn't even have to live near a castle. You just had to exist in a time where kings got bored, land disputes never ended, and power-hungry nobles couldn't stop beefing. If two lords disagreed about something, guess what? It was time for their armies to march through your backyard. War didn't knock, it burned your house down. Let's paint the scene. You're a farmer. The crops are finally ready. Winter's coming. You're thinking, we might make it this year. Then, boom, a war band rolls in. Maybe they're your side. Maybe they're the enemy. Honestly, it doesn't matter. They loot your food, steal your livestock, burn your shed, and maybe, just for fun, set your neighbor's barn on fire. This wasn't strategy. It was terror. Starving the enemy by destroying everything, including innocent villages, was part of the game. And if they didn't burn your village, they might just take you. Conscription, that's a fancy word for forced military service, was common. One day, you're tending goats. The next, you're handed a dull spear and told to fight for your lord's honor in some muddy field against people you've never met. You got no armor, no training, just a wooden shield and a prayer. Now, let's say you're a knight. People think that's glamorous. Shining armor, riding a horse, sword of justice, all that. But reality check? Armor was heavy, up to 60 pounds. You roasted inside it. It was exhausting just walking around, let alone fighting. And if you fell off your horse, good luck getting back up. You're basically a human turtle waiting to be stabbed. And battlefield medicine? Yeah, we covered that. If you got wounded, it wasn't medevac and morphine. It was bite down on this stick and hope you die fast. Even a minor cut could kill you later from infection. Arrow to the leg, you might survive, unless they fix it by cutting off your leg with a saw. No anesthesia, just you screaming while 4 guys hold you down. And the weapons? Medieval warfare wasn't about precision. It was about brute force. Swords, axes, warhammers, tools designed to smash bones, not just slice skin. And the arches? They'd launch volleys of arrows so thick they blocked the sun. Sieges were even worse. You're trapped in a castle or town, slowly starving, while enemy soldiers fling rotting corpses over the walls to spread disease. Sometimes they used human heads as ammo, and when a city fell, it was open season. Looting, arson, massacres, all considered totally normal. Civilians weren't protected. They were targets. Your home burned. Your family gone. You either dead or a prisoner. Medieval war didn't draw lines between combatant and civilian. If your village happened to be on the wrong side of a border, you were part of the battlefield. Every day was a gamble. Will soldiers ride in? Will they take your food? Your animals? Will you be conscripted? Will your home survive? There was no insurance, no military pension, no therapy, just scars and silence. And if you think today's world is chaotic, at least you don't have to worry about flaming arrows crashing through your roof at 2 a.m. or being forced into battle over some royal marriage you've never heard of. In medieval times, war didn't just happen to armies. It happened to everyone. But maybe you make it out. Maybe the soldiers pass. Maybe you hide, survive, and rebuild. But guess what still runs your life? Every decision, every breath? The church. And it's not just about faith. It's about control. In the medieval world, religion wasn't just Sunday morning. It was every day, every hour, every decision, every breath. From the moment you were born to the moment you were buried, usually in the same village, the church had its hands on everything. Think of it this way. Today, religion is mostly about faith. Back then, it was about law, government, medicine, science, and fear, control, all rolled into one. God didn't just watch you. He was reporting directly to the bishop, and if you stepped out of line, there were consequences, heavy ones. There was no separation of church and state. The church was the state, and not just spiritually, politically, financially. They collected taxes. They owned land. In some cases, they owned more land than kings. And if a ruler ever went against the Pope, home excommunication, which sounds like a timeout, but really it meant spiritual death. You couldn't go to heaven. People weren't allowed to trade with you. You were basically a walking ghost. And if you died, straight to hell, no appeal. So yeah, people obeyed. Even kings bowed. Because in medieval Europe, you didn't just believe in heaven and hell, you feared them deeply. They weren't abstract ideas, they were guaranteed outcomes. You do good, you go up. You sin, you burn forever. And people back then, they sinned a lot because the list was pretty much everything. What was a sin? Pretty much everything. Missing Mass equals sin. Having impure thoughts? Sin. Being too proud? Sin. Eating meat on the wrong day? You guessed it. Sin. Even charging interest on a loan was a sin. And the solution? Confession. You go to a priest, spill your sins, and get a punishment, usually prayer, sometimes fasting, occasionally a beating. And if your sins stacked up, you could buy forgiveness. Literally, the church sold indulgences. Pay some gold, shave years off your time in purgatory. Yes, there was an afterlife, waiting room, and you could bribe your way out. And if you think people were skeptical of this, think again. The medieval mind didn't ask, "Is this real?" It asked, "How do I survive it?" People genuinely believed in miracles, in curses, in relics that could heal them or protect them from demons. Some churches claimed to have pieces of the true cross, bones of saints, or even milk from the Virgin Mary. Pilgrims would walk hundreds of miles just to look at a tooth in a gold box. Why? Because it might save their soul. Say the wrong thing and you're toast, literally. Now, here's where it gets dark. Because belief was mandatory. If you questioned the church's teachings, even slightly, you weren't just wrong, you were a heretic. And heresy that got you burned at the stake. Books were rare, with the Bible only in Latin, and only the clergy could read it. You tried to read it yourself, or worse, translate it. That was heresy. People died just for trying to make religion more accessible. And don't even get me started on witches, witch hunts, superstition, and straight up paranoia. Bad crop season, a child dies suddenly, milk spoils too fast, and must be a witch. Women, usually older, poor, or living alone, were accused with zero evidence. And their trial was straight up torture. If you screamed, that was proof. If you bled, that was proof. If you didn't scream, witchcraft. There was no way to win. And this wasn't just fringe stuff. Even the educated believed in omens, relics, demons, and holy visions. Superstition was woven into daily life. People nailed horseshoes to their doors. They prayed to saints for protection from wolves, illness, and heartbreak. Heck, there was a patron saint for toothaches, because when life was brutal, you needed something to believe in. Now don't get it twisted. Religion also gave people hope. It gave structure. It gave meaning. Spirit built cathedrals, inspired music, preserved knowledge in monasteries, but it also held unimaginable power. Power to control, power to punish, power to define truth. And if you didn't conform, you were silenced, erased, or worse. So by now, your soul is stressed, your body's exhausted, you've survived disease, war, prison, and maybe a suspicious priest or two. And you're still thinking, could I survive just one day in medieval times? Well, you've got one last obstacle, your own mind. Because even if you made it physically, mentally, you'd break. If you've made it this far, thank you so much. Please comment where you are watching from. You've survived disease, starvation, war, the church, and justice that makes a horror movie look tame. But now let's ask a different question. Even if your body survived medieval life, would your mind? Because in the Middle Ages, it wasn't just what happened to you. It was the fact that you had no control, no choices, no options, no dreams of becoming something more. You were born into your class, to your village, into your fate. And that was it. Born poor, die poor. If you were born a peasant, you stayed a peasant. No matter how hard you worked, no matter how smart you were, there were no scholarships, no self-made success stories, no rise and grind hustle culture. You belonged to the land, sometimes literally. As a serf, you weren't even free. You couldn't leave your village without permission from your lord. You worked his fields, paid his taxes, fought in his wars, and your reward? Barely enough to survive. Most people didn't travel more than 10 miles from where they were born. They didn't know what the next kingdom looked like. They didn't know what the ocean looked like. Heck, they might not even know what year it was. You worked, you prayed, you paid, you died, and that's if nothing went wrong. Death was always waiting. You buried your children. You buried your friends. You buried your parents before you understood what grief was. Loss was constant. Death was familiar. And life? Life was short, brutal, and totally uncertain. So what kept people going? Faith, routine, and the belief, deeply held, that their suffering meant something, that a better world was waiting after this one, because this life was a test, a place of pain, temptation, and trial. And the next one was the reward. That was the only story that made sense of it all. And sometimes that belief helped. It gave people strength, a reason to endure another day in the mud, in the cold, in the dark. But not always. Because mental health, that wasn't a concept. Depression, possession, anxiety, weak faith, nightmares, witchcraft, trauma. Get over it. Everyone had it. There was no therapy, no support, no break from the endless repetition of hard labor, heavy guilt, and existential dread. No escape, even in your dreams. Even when you closed your eyes, you weren't free. Nightmares were seen as divine warnings or demonic attacks. People believed dreams could curse them, condemn them, or reveal secrets they didn't want to know. There was no safe space, not even in sleep. No control, no escape, no silence. And worst of all, you had no voice. You couldn't speak out, couldn't complain, couldn't resist. The king ruled your land. The priest ruled your soul. The Lord ruled your body, and fear ruled your mind. The very idea of freedom, of choosing your path, changing your fate, didn't exist. Not in law, not in culture, not in your imagination. In modern times, we can imagine a better life. Back then, most people didn't even know such a life was possible. They didn't dream of escaping. They dreamed of surviving. And that's what makes medieval life so brutal. Not just the death, disease, and dirt, but the quiet, constant, psychological weight of knowing this is all there is, and it will never get better. So yeah, you wouldn't last a day. Not because you're weak, but because you've tasted freedom. You've felt choice. You've dreamed big. And once you've had that, you can't go back. So the next time you hear someone say, I was born in the wrong era, smile and remember the lice, the leeches, the starvation, the silence, and the inescapable, suffocating stillness of a world with no way out. And thank whatever century you're in that you were born after the Middle Ages.